The Ukraine war and the risk of Donald Trump becoming U.S. president again are major issues at NATO's 75th anniversary summit in Washington. The military alliance faces more challenges than ever before. What are they, and what's next for NATO? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. An anniversary is usually cause for celebration, but with NATO facing greater challenges than ever before, the summit in Washington that marks 75 years since its founding will be a more serious affair. Set up at the beginning of the Cold War, its focus was to counter the nuclear-armed power of the Soviet Union. The USSR is gone, but NATO remains, expanding from a dozen members to 32. Its focus has expanded too, well beyond the North Atlantic, fighting wars in Afghanistan, the Balkans, and Libya. Russia remains its main adversary, and both sides are coming closer to outright conflict in the war in Ukraine. Then there are the divisions within the organization, and what might happen if Donald Trump becomes president again of NATO's largest member. So, what challenges does the alliance face? And what does its future mean for global peace or the risk of more war? We'll be taking a look at where NATO is now and what might come next with our guests shortly. But first, this report from Sharif.
A milestone for the military alliance, overshadowed by security threats and divisions from within its ranks. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, is marking its 75th anniversary at an event dominated by Russia's war in Ukraine. US President Joe Biden promised full support for Kyiv when he welcomed member states to Washington, D.C. on Tuesday. Russia has carried out a wave of drone and missile strikes on Ukrainian cities recently, including one on a children's hospital in the capital.
Nearly 24 allied partners have signed a bilateral security agreements with Ukraine, and more countries will follow. Today, I'm announcing the historic donation of air defense equipment for Ukraine. The United States, Germany, the Netherlands, Romania, and Italy will provide Ukraine with the equipment for 5 additional strategic air defense systems.
The summit comes 4 months ahead of the US presidential election. The vote's outcome could impact the future of the 32-member military alliance. Allies are preparing for the possible return of NATO skeptic Donald Trump to return to the White House and its consequences. During his previous term, Trump threatened to withdraw from the organization and is against providing more aid to Ukraine. The US is a NATO founding member and its biggest financial donor. President Volodymr Zelenskyy, who's also attending the summit, remains optimistic about the US policy towards Ukraine.
I hope that the United States will never seriously think to go out from NATO. I think so, but it's not my decision. I'm just sharing with you my thoughts. And I hope that if people of America will vote for President Trump, I hope that his policy with Ukraine will not change.
There are internal divisions too. The Hungarian Prime Minister's meetings with the Russian and Chinese presidents have led to tension. And Turkey and Hungary cross frustration by delaying their approval for new members, Finland and Sweden. But outgoing chief Jens Stoltenberg says NATO members are united and are increasing their contributions.
So 23 allies are investing more, or 2% at least, of the GDP on defense. This is twice as many as just 4 years ago. And then it will further strengthen our partnership with the Asia-Pacific partners.
NATO was founded in 1949 to counter threats by the former Soviet Union. States consider an attack on one member as an attack on all. So far, it's managed to avoid direct confrontation with Russia, but many believe the risk of that happening has never been greater. Sharif, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. From London, we're joined by Shashank Joshi, the defense editor at The Economist. He's written extensively about Ukraine and NATO. In Paris, Janine di Giovanni is a foreign policy analyst who's reported from several NATO wars as a correspondent. And in Cork, Ireland, Geoffrey Roberts is an emeritus professor of history at University College Cork. He specialises in the history of Soviet and Russian military and foreign power. A warm welcome to you all. Thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Shashank, let me start with you today. At this NATO summit, the main focus is going to be on Russia's war with Ukraine, right? I mean, how much is that going to dominate these meetings and these discussions?
Well, the answer is actually not as much as you might think, because the principal question, which is how quickly to allow Ukraine to join NATO, has really been taken. And it's a decision that has been settled in a rather cautious direction. The allies will say that Ukraine's progress into NATO is what they will say irreversible. But that word really disguises really deep divisions among the allies, with America, but also Germany and other countries hesitant to allow an accelerated path to membership, as opposed to some like Poland and in the East. And so we have no real progress on the issue, and no real debate will be necessary to have. I think in some respects, we also shouldn't forget, although Ukraine is very high up the agenda, the allies also have a lot to discuss in their own defense, their own regional defense plans, the institutions that make those plans real. So Ukraine is a big topic, but it's not the only topic at this summit this week.
Janine, what do you say from your perspective? What are the biggest priorities for NATO right now, and what are they going to be discussing most at this summit?
Right. So I am the executive director of the Reckoning Project. We're a war crimes unit inside Ukraine. So we're more than 30 people working on the ground, tracking Kremlin war crimes. So obviously for us and for the Ukrainians we speak to, it is of huge priority that the U.S. stays in NATO and continues funding and giving the support that they have up until now. There's more than 130,000 recorded incidents of Kremlin criminality, and those that are recorded. We don't know what will happen once certain areas that are occupied are opened up. So this is really the main focus. And earlier this year at the Munich Security Forum, it was a rather grim message that came to those of us that were there. The first was that, is Trump coming? It looks like he is. The second was that Navalny was killed whilst we were there at the opening ceremonies. So it is, can Putin do whatever he wants with impunity? Will he ever be held to accountability? And the third is, and the most important, I think, is Ukraine losing on the front line? And what are they going to do? Will there be any going to the table? Will there be negotiations? How will this war look in the long run? Will it turn into a forever war like Afghanistan? So these are some things I'm thinking about now.
Shashank, I saw you reacting to what Janine was saying there. I wanted to give you a chance to jump in.
I think Janine's identified a number of the really vital issues. And I think the specter of Donald Trump is perhaps one of the most significant problems. Trump, obviously, in the 2018 summit, when he was president, the very famous summit in Brussels, came close to pulling out of the alliance. And what you're seeing now is that European allies are trying to judge how far they need to hedge against that possibility again, including by expanding their own defense spending and building up alignments in Europe that could substitute for US protection. But I think it's important to say European allies are not yet fatalistic about Trump and NATO. They're not giving up on American membership of NATO. They still hope that Trump, should he become president later this year, could be persuaded to stay in the alliance, could be persuaded that actually European allies have done a huge amount on defense spending, for instance. To give you one example, this year, 23 out of 32 allies will meet the alliance's target of spending 2% on defense. 10 years ago, that was about 3 or 4, and that he might therefore accept European allies are finally stepping up. But I think that's what they'll have their eye on for the next several months. And they will be attempting to influence and shape the Trump team as it begins to take shape.
Geoffrey, from your vantage point, has NATO's strategy when it comes to Russia and Ukraine been successful or unsuccessful? And what does giving more money to Ukraine, what does providing them with more weaponry in the long run mean?
Well, the first thing I think is that NATO has been very lucky about the timing of its 75th anniversary, and because the summit is taking place at a time when, Ukraine is losing the war with Russia, losing it very badly, but it hasn't lost the war and it fights on. So that enables NATO to keep up the pretense that some kind of Ukrainian victory is possible. The second thing it enables NATO and the West to avoid the whole question of how this war is going to end in the form of negotiations and some kind of peace settlement. I suppose the other thing that's going on, of course, which has already been spoken about, is that NATO and Western leaders are putting on a political show for Biden. In order to sort of bolster his chances in the American presidential election. Now, I have to say, I personally don't think that Trump poses an existential threat to NATO. I think, very likely that he'll shake up the alliance in various ways, but I don't think he poses an existential threat. I think Trump could very, very well pose an existential threat to Ukraine because in the form of a significant curtailment of US support for Ukraine. And Ukraine is in such a bad position now. A Trump presidency could be the final blow to Ukraine as far as its war with Russia is concerned.
Janine, I saw you reacting to what Geoffrey was saying. I'm going to give you a chance to jump into, but let me also ask you a little bit more about what you're hearing from colleagues on the ground and civilians on the ground in Ukraine. I mean, you spend a lot of time there. When you're not there, you're in touch with people there. When it comes to the specter of a potential second Trump presidency, how concerned are they about that, about what it means when it comes to NATO, or NATO members, rather, continuing to support Ukraine going forward?
Yes. I mean, my team are entirely Ukrainian. I'm there very often. And when I'm not, I'm on the phone with them or in Zoom every day. So I'm very much in touch. They're terrified. They're terrified of a Trump presidency. It's interesting what Geoffrey says. But I do feel that Trump is a major threat, not just to NATO, not just to Ukraine, but to human rights. All right. And that's basically what I look at. I see everything through the lens of human rights. And I think that should Trump get in, he's expressed very clearly as he identifies Ukrainians, people that hate us. I think that support will wane. And we know more than anything, what matters when battles are fought is political will. So right now, in a sense, there's another elephant in the room in Washington, D.C. that no one is talking about. While we're all looking at Ukraine, there is Gaza. And you can be sure that all of them are thinking about that. Yesterday, one Turkish delegate said that, is this a hierarchy of humanity that we are looking so intently at Ukraine to help Ukraine, to save Ukraine, and yet we are leaving Gaza to die? And just one more example, the hospital in Ukraine, horrific, hitting the children's hospital. It's cruel. It's a war crime. It's absolutely devastating. But there's been more than 13,000 children killed in Gaza since October 7th. And there is not the same reaction. Keir Starmer does not make strong statements. It's not front page news of all the British papers, as it was with the Children's Hospital. So I think that this is something that will very much be on people's minds, if not addressed, because of course we know Biden is in a terrible position in America with the students who are protesting on campuses, who are deeply upset about his policy, his and Blinken's policy in Gaza. So I think this is something that is also going to be looked at in a very different way over these next few days in Washington, as it should be.
And Geoffrey, it looks to me like you wanted to add to what Janine was saying when it comes to Gaza. So I'm going to give you the opportunity right now.
Yeah, well, obviously, I agree with what Janine said there, particularly in relation to emphasis on human rights. Yeah, there's a very stark contrast. Okay, this recent missile strike on the Children's Hospital in Kiev was a very, very tragic event. But actually, civilian casualties in Ukraine have been relatively low compared to the scale of the conflict. UN count is about 10,000, including a few hundred children. That's in the last, nearly 3 years now. We compare that to Gaza, and it's 13,000, including 4,000 children have been killed so far. So all these stories we keep constantly hearing in the media about Russian atrocities, and also in the Russian media about Ukrainian atrocities, as far as I can see, they're not true. Actually, in terms of the Ukraine war, both sides have actually shown considerable restraint in conducting the war, which is not to say there have been atrocities. It's not to say there haven't been civilian casualties. Of course, there have been. But in the Ukraine war, the overwhelming majority, hundreds of thousands of people, have been soldiers, not civilians. If the war in Gaza was being conducted in the same way that the war in Ukraine is being conducted, there'd be far fewer casualties and infinitely fewer children's casualties. And I think this is Justine says, what is NATO, what are the West going to say about that at its summit? I doubt that they'll say anything at all.
Shashank, I'm going to get to you with a couple of questions in just a second, but Janine, I want to ask you to follow up on what Geoffrey was saying, that he was talking about atrocities or lack thereof. He was talking about statistics, and I saw you reacting to that. And because you do investigate war crimes, I want to ask you your reaction to what he was saying.
Look, I came of age, sadly, during 3 genocides, Srebrenica, Rwanda, and the Yazidi slaughter. So numbers, and Geoffrey is absolutely right, the civilian casualties are nowhere near the 20-to-1 ratio that the Israelis are killing Palestinians in terms of Hamas combatants. The sheer number of casualties in Gaza has shocked me, and I've reported more than 19 wars, several of them NATO wars. It has shocked me beyond belief. But again, I want to get back to political will. Now, there has been a huge political will to support Ukraine. Here in Europe, I think all of us know families that have taken in Ukrainian refugees. If you drive through small town America, you see Ukrainian flags flying. There's this enormous sense that Ukraine is holding back, is holding the front line of democracy against Putin, right? And what was NATO founded for? Essentially, it was against the threat of communism. So Putin, in many ways, still symbolizes that. And the Ukrainian fighters on the front line, who Geoffrey is right, there are taking terrible losses from the frontline soldiers. They symbolize something important to us. At some point, I'd like to hear what Shashank says, but I want to talk about the war in Kosovo in 1999, which was the first time NATO went to war since 1949, the Balkan Wars. And I was there, and I'd like to see everyone's thoughts on the lessons we learned from the Kosovo War, because that was an example of political will. That was a time when 19 NATO countries came together to defeat the Bosnian Serbs. I don't know if we have that same political will anymore. I think there's so many fissures, especially within NATO, with Hungary and potentially other countries, the rise of far right in Europe, if it can maintain that.
All right, Shashank, thanks for your patience. In fact, Janine just mentioned what I wanted to ask you about, because I want to drill a little deeper into all that is going on when it comes to this summit. This summit, of course, is meant as a projection of strength and unity, but we know that there are internal rifts among member states in NATO. Hungary and Turkey, they were holdout members that delayed Sweden and Finland's bid to join NATO. And also, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, he has ties with Moscow. He had that visit to Moscow just in the past week. That's created tension amongst member states. So can NATO obscure or can they hide disunity amongst members going forward? How is that going to impact things for them?
I think the answer I would give is that there have always been rifts inside NATO. Always transatlantic rifts going back to the Eisenhower administration. There have been rifts between Greece and Turkey. There have been rifts between East and West in the latter years, including over Ukraine. Really quite profound ones between France under Charles de Gaulle and his successors, who took a more nationalist line, who indeed withdrew from NATO's integrated military command, only coming back into it about 10 or 15 years ago. So these rifts have always been there. I am not convinced that these rifts are more serious today than they were, and I think I could point to many more examples where the Allies have eventually found a consensus. Yes, Turkey held up the membership of Sweden and Finland. It has now given way. Those countries are in. Turkey also held back on approving the regional defense plans for the alliance. Those plans, those historic plans, are now approved. So I am not terribly worried about these rifts because ultimately that's what happens in an alliance of 32 people. The fact is, that the rifts between countries like Russia and China may not be as visible because they don't play out in open societies, but they are, in fact, in some cases very serious and actually just as divisive. The last thing I'd just like to say briefly is I really do think it requires a strenuous objection to the point made earlier that Russia is showing restraint in Ukraine. It's true that most casualties are military casualties, but I'm afraid it is simply incorrect that reports of atrocities are falsified or mischaracterized. We saw in around Kiev, for example, in Bucha, clear evidence of Russian atrocities, including rape, torture, and murder of Ukrainian civilians, including prisoners of war as well. And I think that cannot go unanswered or unsaid.
Shashank, you mentioned China in your answer just now, and I want to ask you more specifically about that because NATO is also going to be seeking to reassure its Asia-Pacific partners of the alliance's continued support against an increasingly aggressive China. How concerned are NATO members right now about China's growing assertiveness in the Asia-Pacific?
Well, they're concerned, but I think there's a misunderstanding that NATO as an alliance is somehow interested in getting involved in Asia and deterring China and getting stuck in. It isn't. What it's worried about is the way that China affects the security of Europe, whether that is through traditional military means, such as the potential to provide arms to Russia or the provision of drones in the Middle East on NATO's southern periphery, or whether that is via more indirect means, such as cyber activity, cyber operations, and also, to give another example, China's influence in space operations. We've seen evidence of Chinese companies providing satellite imagery to Russia's armed forces in Ukraine. So NATO isn't getting involved in Asia to get involved in a war over Taiwan, for instance. NATO is interested in how China will increasingly shape the security and defense environment of the Euro-Atlantic area. And I think that makes obvious sense, given the rapidly rising power of the PLA and the Chinese.
All right, Geoffrey, you would have heard Shashank. He took issue with your comments about Russia acting with restraint. So do you have a response to him?
I'll repeat my point. Okay, both sides in the Ukraine war are committing atrocities, without doubt. I don't see any evidence that the Russian side is committing any more atrocities than the Ukrainian side, and I don't see any evidence that either side is actually conducting organised, deliberate mass atrocities against the civilian population. And the proof of that is in the relatively low number of civilian casualties in Ukraine. If what's been said was going on in Ukraine was actually going on, buka everywhere, we would see civilian casualties in the hundreds of thousands. And not the tens of thousands. Okay, so I stand by my point there. But look, any civilian death, any atrocity is truly terrible, which is why it's so important to bring this war to an end as soon as possible, in order to avert any further civilian deaths or atrocities by either side. And I don't
Geoffrey, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we are starting to run out of time.
Summit is actually contributing anything towards a path to peace in Ukraine. That's the problem. That's the problem
Geoffrey,
I have.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I do see that Janine wants to jump in. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Thank you for your points. And I have to contradict you. Well, with all due respect, I respect your knowledge of the Soviet Union, but you're wrong about the Kremlin's atrocities in Ukraine. I spend my days going through testimonies of victims. Right now, my team is working on something which is so sinister, which is the Kremlin's abduction of Ukrainian children, 19,000 of them. We're tracking them. We've been tracking them for a year.
I do want to get back to Shashank because I want to ask you more specifically right now about what it means for NATO going forward. We've all spoken during this discussion about the concerns about the prospect of another Trump presidency. What does it mean going forward for NATO if that is the case?
Well, it means that NATO relies on America. That's the fact. Yes, we have seen Europeans step up. Yes, they spend more on defense. We've seen some remarkable growth of capability. To give you just, one example of that, we saw Jake Sullivan, the American National Security Advisor, say just now that NATO allies will add 650 F-35 aircraft alone, along with 1,000 air defense systems in the next 5 years. But there's a big but, which is that without America providing headquarters, enablers, refuelers, and all kinds of other enabling systems, Europeans cannot at this stage defend themselves. And if they are to do that, they will have to dramatically increase defense spending. So a great deal hinges on the decisions taken by the next president, if that is Donald Trump, as to the cohesion and capacity of NATO to survive and endure.
Janine, let me also ask you about the fact that so far NATO has managed to avoid direct confrontation with Russia, but many fear about how much longer that can continue. The more that NATO countries send support and weapons to Ukraine, does it get more likely that we see a scenario in which there would be a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia? Is that within the realm of possibility going forward?
Yes, it is, because I think Putin, we're not certain what is going on in his mind. He's so isolated. I think it absolutely is a possibility. But I think more to the point, and this is where I come back to Geoffrey's point, we do need to look at how this war is going to end. Is it going to be a war that goes on for decades, where it will become a guerrilla war, where the front lines will be pushed back a small amount and hundreds of thousands of people are going to die? There has to be some kind of negotiated settlement. But at this point, I can say from the Ukrainian side, they're not ready to go to the table, and nor will they. They want to continue fighting. They want complete territorial integrity, and that means Crimea. So it's just a matter of how much Putin feels trapped, like a rat in a cage, and how he will lash out. But I do think it's possible. I mean, I think hitting the hospital in Kyiv the other day was symbolic for him as well. He had been quiet for a while, and then this. So, I do think we have to look at, consideration of what he could possibly do.
Geoffrey, just a final thought I want to ask you about. From your vantage point, what are the biggest challenges facing NATO going forward?
I mean, NATO was founded 75 years ago on the basis of a myth, and that was the myth of a threat of Soviet military aggression against Western Europe, founded to actually defend against that threat, that supposed threat. Why do I call it a myth? Because I've spent decades working in Russian archives. So I know that there was no Soviet military threat in the sense that the West defined it. Certainly there was a political and ideological challenge from Soviet communism, but it wasn't a military threat. And now 75 years later, NATO is being remilitarized. Yeah. On the basis of another myth, the myth that Putin and Russia is poised to strike at Western Europe, the West again, in forms of further military adventures after Ukraine. As far as I see no evidence to suggest that is the case. So I think, the challenge that NATO faces is getting itself out of this militaristic, war-oriented mindset and actually finding bridges to peace, embracing diplomacy, rediscovering its diplomatic mission, which was the mission it defined for itself in the 1990s when it pursued the idea of partnerships for peace, including partnership for peace
Geoffrey.
with Russia.
Geoffrey, I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Shashank Joshi, Janine di Giovanni, and Geoffrey Roberts. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed, Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.